Good evening, everyone. My name is David Ashrick, as Joe has said, and I'm from the Troy area, but not originally from the Troy area. I don't claim Michigan. Are there any native Michiganians here? Okay, I sincerely apologize, but I'm not fond of your state. But this is where I live for now, and I'm willing to put up with it. I actually moved to Detroit, Michigan. I believe it's the 8th largest city in North America, and I moved there from a town in South Dakota of 300 people called Hermosa, South Dakota. And so to say that it was culture shock for my wife and I would be a mild understatement to move from a town of 300 to one of the largest cities in the nation. Two of my very favorite activities in the world are rock climbing and surfing. And you are familiar, no doubt, with the geography of Michigan, and you know that there are no oceans here, though you do have a very large, flat, waveless lake. And you don't have any mountains. In fact, I marvel at some of the things that local Michiganders ski down. Absolutely remarkable, to say the least. But anyway, it's nice to be here in Michigan. Despite your lackluster geography, it is a pleasure to be here at Lansing Community College, and I think this is going to be a very special time. I've been invited by Mark and a few of the others here to come and to present a series that will be engaging, and we'll be dealing with some of the themes of theism, and particularly the theistic view of Christianity, and that is really the thrust of what we will be addressing here. Our presentation, the overarching presentation, as Joe has said, is called Does God Exist and Does It Matter? We're going to be breaking that up into some subtitles that I think you'll find very, very engaging, very compelling. Now, I do want you to know that the only reason we started late tonight, I'm usually a very, very punctual person. We just got started a little late because our video man his car broke down, and he can be forgiven for that. But normally, we will be starting at 6:15 on the button. We will make about a 45 to 50-minute presentation. It will not be a particularly long presentation, and then we'll have a time for questions and answers at the close of that. So the whole program together should not be more than 60 minutes, and that will be dependent largely upon the questions and answers. So it will be a very timely, though not entirely brief program. Okay? I could tell you more about myself, but we'll have time to do that over the course of the next 5 days. I suppose a very quick version would be that I became a follower of Jesus Christ, who I consider to be the Messiah of the Bible, 9 years ago. I became a follower of Jesus Christ at a public university campus. I was studying medicine at the University of Wyoming, and really was totally disinterested in the claims of Christianity, was totally disinterested in the claims of theism in general. I thought that Christianity was for ignorant people, and I thought that anybody who believed in theism probably had not thought through it well enough. My conversion to theism, and Christianity specifically, was a remarkable one, and I will have time to go into that a little bit later in the week. But I do want you to know I come to you today as somebody who formerly was not favorable to the claims of theism, who formerly was not favorable particularly to the claims of Christianity, and prior to my conversion to be a follower of Jesus Christ, I was interested in Hinduism. I read large sections of the Bhagavad Gita, which is one of the Hindu holy books, very interested in it, was interested in Buddhism for a time. While I do not claim to be an expert on any of these things, I can say that that which really resonated with my soul and that which I found to be the most credible, historically, existentially, as well as possessing internal cohesiveness, was Christianity. And I'll be talking more about that throughout the week. So anyway, I'm not coming to you today as somebody who was raised in a patently Christian environment, who has known nothing else. If you would have told me 10 years ago that I would be presenting evidences for Christianity and theism, I would have utterly scoffed. Because the crowd that I ran with was a punk rock crowd. We were very, very atheistic, sometimes vehemently so. And you could be anything. You could be anything, literally. You could be a transvestite. You could be a pedophiliac. You could be anything. But to be a Christian was considered basically the lowest form of intellectual culture. That was the crowd I ran in. And so if you would have told me 10 years ago that I would become a Christian, I would have suggested that you were probably just this side of insanity. So let's begin with our presentation tonight. It's entitled, Does God Exist? Does It Matter? You can see the subtitle there, A Brief Yet Compelling. And we're not going to make any pretense here to be covering exhaustively the evidences for the existence of God. That would take annals and annals. It would take years, days, and we just do not have time for that. But I'm going to present to you tonight what I consider to be an extremely compelling case for the credibility of God's existence. I want to start by letting you know that even defining the word God is exceedingly problematic. To talk about the Christian view of God, it's a very different God than, say, our friends the Hindus would hold to. To talk about God in any meaningful way is difficult. It's even difficult to arrive at a definition, a functional definition of who and what God is. And we are not going to take the time in this particular 5-part series to survey the different concepts of God. We just don't have the time for that, and we don't have really the opportunity to do that here. So what we're going to do is just address and defend the Christian concept of God. That is the God of the Bible. That does not mean, you might be saying, well, that's not fair at the outset. You've already assumed at the outset that it is the Christian God that exists, if in fact God exists at all. And I freely admit that that is an assumption. It is not an a priori assumption, but it is an assumption. It's an assumption that we're making in the interest of time, not because we believe that that's not something that also should be demonstrated. It's just not the kind of thing that we have time to demonstrate here. Of course, it would go without saying that if the Christian God does exist, and if the claims that the Christian God makes in the Bible are true, then that would mean a priori that the other concepts of God would be rendered inaccurate and obsolete, whether it's the Hindu version of God or perhaps even the Islamic version of God, etc. We won't get into that. Now, I want to start by saying that we're not going to spend a lot of time actually in the Bible proper, and there's good reason for that. If you set out to try and demonstrate the existence of God by quoting the Bible, it's really assuming a considerable amount at the outset. If you would have come to me when I was studying medicine there at the University of Wyoming and would have said, I'm going to prove to you that God exists because it says so in John chapter 1, in verse 1, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God, I would have found that to be a very, very uncompelling, non-persuasive argument for God's existence. Would you agree with that? I mean, you're assuming so much of what you're trying to prove. And so we're not going to be spending a lot of time in the Bible. We will cite it several times for historical references, but not at this point for inspired references. We're not assuming that, not at all. But it is important to recognize that as the Bible deals with the question of God, the Bible does not set out to prove God's existence in a syllogistic fashion. It doesn't set out to say, if this, then this, therefore this. God is declared, He is not proved. The Bible simply assumes His existence. That is to say, from a biblical perspective, that is from the writers of the perspective of the writers of the Old Testament, whether you're talking about Isaiah or Ezekiel or Moses or the writers of the New Testament, Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, James, or Peter, they believed that God's existence was what is called in philosophy a properly basic belief. Okay? That is to say that it constituted an axiomatic first principle from which all other beliefs and positions proceed. In other words, if you read the Bible through, you're not going to find the proof there for God's existence. You will find many testable hypotheses there that I believe are testable and that are falsifiable, but you're not going to find any of the Bible writers, whether in the Old Testament or the New Testament, setting out to prove in a syllogistic type fashion, God exists and here's the proof for it. The Bible writers, whether in the Old or the New Testament, began as part of their properly basic first principles that God, in fact, exists. And probably the classic example of this would be Genesis chapter 1, verse 1. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Moses does not set out here to prove that God exists. He simply declares that He exists and moves from that properly basic belief to the acts of God. Genesis 1 and 2, which is God's creative power. If you're going to talk about God creating, then you are of necessity suggesting that God, of course, exists. And we'll talk a little bit more about that. Now, historically, when apologists, Christian apologists, or just theistic apologists in general, have set out to prove God's existence, not less than 20 lines of evidence have been advanced to prove God's existence. Now, you notice that prove there is in quotations. Because we're here at an institution of higher learning, a college, it's important to understand the limits of what can and cannot be proved. If any of you are science-minded, you know that there is a significant limitation to what is actually provable. To try and prove that 1 + 1 is 2 is not even provable in the most universal sense. To try and prove that I exist is not provable in the most universal sense. So when we use the term prove, proving that God exists, what we're going to use the term prove as is I'm going to suggest that the preponderance of evidence suggests that God exists. That's my definition of proof. It's not an absolute proof. It's not a scientific proof. It's not a mathematical proof. Notice it again. The preponderance of evidence, that is, the weight of evidence, suggests that God, in fact, exists. And I'll be unpacking that for you. I just want you to understand what our definition of prove is and isn't. And that's why we have purposely put it in quotations for you there. The combined weight of these apologetic proofs present a formidable and convincing case. Apologetic, of course, coming from the Greek word apologia, which means to give a defense, to give a response, or to give an answer. And that's precisely what we will be doing in this series.